Hey guys, in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to create a pretty simple and easy to use system that allows you to use keys to unlock doors. So just to show you how it's going to look when we're done, if you go up to a door and you try to open it, it's going to not open because it's locked. And if you grab the key and go up to the door and try to open it, then it will open. And you can of course close it and open it as many times as you want because you have that key. But if I come over to this door, you see, even though I have that key, I can't open this door unless I grab the key for that door, and now I can open that door as well. So that's basically what it's going to look like when we're all done. And we're going to go ahead and do this completely from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and open the Epic Game Launcher and launch the current version of Unreal on. I'm currently using 4.24.1. I'd recommend updating to that one or newer if you're trying to follow along. All right, so we want to come down here. We want to select games at the bottom for our new project. And we want the first person template and go ahead and hit next. And make sure you have with starter content because the door is part of the starter content. So we want to have that selected. And then I'm just going to call this door and lock, or door and key, I mean. And go ahead and create the project. And I'm going to move this other project over here so I can reference it. Okay, so now that we have the project launched, the first thing we're going to want to do is create a blueprint for our door and for our key. So right click down here in the content browser, actually go up to the content directory first, and then right click, and we want to create a new blueprint. So select blueprint class, and we want it to be an actor. So select actor, and we'll call this BP underscore door. And we'll do the exact same thing again, and we'll call this one BP underscore key. Oops, don't do that. And then file save. All right, so open up the door, and we'll go ahead and we'll create that first. So on the left here, we want to add two static mesh components, one for the door frame and one for the door. So hit add component and then search for static mesh, and we'll call this one the door frame. And again, search for static mesh, and we want this one to be called door. And by default, it parents them. I don't really want them to be parented, so drag the door and attach it directly to the root there so they're not parented. All right, so for the door frame, over here on the right for the static mesh, we want door frame, and you'll see that gives us a nice door frame. And then for the door itself, just search for door, and there we go, there's our door. Now, obviously, it's not quite in the middle, so we can fix that just by dragging it over. And you might have to come up here and change this 10 to a 5 so that we can get it a little bit more accurate. There we go. So now we have it nice and in the center. And the next thing we're going to want to do is create a couple little variables that will help us with opening the door and determining which keys open the door. So the first one we're going to want to add a click variable over here on the left, and we're going to call it key channel. And I'll explain exactly what a key channel is here in a second, but just for now, set it to an integer. And we want this variable to be instance editable, blueprint read only, expose on spawn, and private. And I'm going to add it to a category called constants. So basically what this is, it's going to be a number, obviously. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And whatever number you set that to, any key that's also set to that number will unlock that door. So if we set this door to 5, then any key in the world that has a key channel of 5 will be able to open this door. So that's kind of how you will link keys to doors. And then another one we're going to want here in a little bit is a boolean for whether or not it's open. So select variable and say open question mark. And again, we want this to be a boolean. And this one should be private. And that's probably all we need. And I'm going to move it to a private category just so we know it's private. Okay. So now we have those variables. Let's go ahead and create the key class. So go back to the content browser and open up the key. And inside of here, we kind of want to do the same thing. We need to add a static mesh. So type static mesh. And for this one, we want it to be the key, right? But there is no key in the starter content pack. So I've provided one in the link of this video. So just uh, go to the description of this video, and there will be a link to a Dropbox, and it will link you to a zip file, and just download that zip file and add those files to your project. It should look something like this. You should get two files, a warrant key FBX and a warrant key PNG. So once you have those files, just go ahead and I'm going to make a little, well, whatever. Just drag them into the content directory. I think you only need to drag the FBX file, actually, and just say import all. And then, oh, no, it didn't. Okay, so that brings in the FBX file. And we also want this texture, so bring in the texture. All right, so now we got our key and we got our texture, but the material that it created doesn't actually have this texture applied to it, so we need to go ahead and do that real quick. So go ahead and open up this metal material that it created, and we don't need this guy. We want to do a texture sample, so right click and type texture sample and hook the RGB up to there. And the texture that we want to sample is that Warren key that we just imported. And so if we apply and save, and we go back to the content directory and we look at the key, you can see it has that Warren texture applied to it. If you want to make it like a little bit more shiny, because after all it is a key, you can hold down 1 on your keyboard and then left click, and that will create a constant variable. And you can hook that up to metallic and just go ahead and set it to 1. You can play around with the other values if you want to, but for the sake of this tutorial, I think this is a good enough looking key. So there we go. We got our key model, and now back in the BP key blueprint, we can select the warrant key, and there we go. Now we have a nice key model. And then just like we did for the door, we're also going to want to be able to specify which channel this is on. So over here on the right, again, we're going to add a key channel variable, and this is going to be set to integer. And again, we want to select that it's instance editable so that we can edit it per instance of the key. We want it blueprint read only because we don't want it to be changed once it's set. We want it to expose on spawn, so that if somebody spawns one of these in blueprints, they can set it. And we want it to be private because we don't want it to be changed outside of the class. And the category is just going to be constants again, since it's a blueprint read only variable, like so. All right, so the next thing we can kind of do is start setting up our scene here. It's not quite done yet, but we can at least start setting it up. So if we drag in a door and drag in a key, and I'm going to kind of rotate it around here, like so, whatever. All right, so now we got our door and we got our key. And if you click on the door, you can see it has the key channel specified as 0, and this one is also specified as 0. So since they're both 0, once we write the code, they'll work with each other. But before we can do that, we need to be able to actually pick up the key, because you can see if we play it right now, we're not going to be able to open this door, we're not going to be able to pick up the key, because we haven't actually coded that yet. And a really good way to do that, whenever you want, like, let's say the F button, for example, to be an interactable button. So if you're looking at a key, you want F to pick up the key. If you're looking at a door, you want F to open the door. Maybe if you had like people and you wanted to talk to them and to press F, or some sort of action in your game and there's just like an interaction key. A really good way to implement that type of behavior is with something called a interface. And what an interface is basically it's kind of like a class that just defines a bunch of functions that other classes, like our door or our key, can implement, and then anybody who implements that interface will get those function calls. So, for example, we would have an interface called an interactable interface, and inside of there, it will basically say, it will have a function called onInteracted, and anytime an interactable object gets interacted with, it will call that onInteracted function, and then the door or the key or the person or whatever could handle it any way they wanted. So if that didn't make a lot of sense, hopefully it will in a second once I actually show you how to implement. So just go ahead and follow along. So to create an interface, just right click and go to Blueprints and go to Blueprint Interface. And again, we want to call this the Interactable Interface. And so you can use this interface on anything in your game that you want to be interactable. So if you open it up, like I said, it's just a class, and all it has is a bunch of functions over here on the right. You can see you can hit add new, add new function, and it'll just keep creating functions. But for our purposes, we only want one function right now, and it's going to be called on interaction. And this function is only going to have one parameter, so you can click on it, and then down here you can add parameters. And basically it's going to take in the player that did the interaction. So we're going to do a first-person character, and this is going to be called the player. So we'll know, who interacted with us. All right, so now that we have this interactable interface, we can come back to our door and our key, and we can implement that interface because both of these items are interactable. So if you click on the door and you go over to class settings, there's a section on the right for interfaces, and just drop down the add button and type interactable, and you'll see there's our interactable interface, and compile. And you'll notice on the left here, it adds an interface section. I believe if you're on an older version of Unreal than I am, you're going to have to right click in the event graph and search for on interaction in order to define it. But in 24, they've added it over here on the left for you to easily see it, and all you have to do is right click and say implement function. And so now you can see it's defined this event on interaction for us that's going to eventually get called whenever the door is interacted with. And we can do the same thing in the key class. So if we go back to the key and we go to the class settings and we add the interactable interface, it's going to pop up over here on the left. We can right click, implement interface, and there we go. So for right now, I'm just going to do a simple little print string just to show you that it works. And it's just going to say interacted with key, and I'm going to copy this and put it back in the door, and I'm going to print out interacted with door, just so when this function gets called, it will print this, and you can see kind of what's going on. So the last thing we need to do is we need somebody to call this function, and the person that's going to be calling this function is the player. So back in the player blueprint, which we haven't actually opened yet, so go back to the content directory, go to first person blueprint, blueprints, and first person character. So inside here, we basically want to write some logic where, if you walk up to this door and you press F, it does like a line trace. It checks, oh, you collided with the door. Does the door implement the interactable interface? Oh, yes, it does. Call on interacted. And if you did it with the key, it would do the same thing. But if you went up and you pressed F against this wall, well, this wall doesn't implement the on interacted interface, so it would fail and it would not try to call on interacted anywhere. So we need to do a line trace when you press F, basically, or really any key that you want. So we're going to go up to the project settings and add our F as our interaction key. So if you don't have project settings already open, you can go to File or Edit Project Settings. And then over here on the left, go to Input. And under Action Mappings, we want to add a new one for our interaction. So Interact. And again, I'm going to set it to F key. Feel free to set it to whatever you want, like so. And then now we can go back to the player blueprint, and down here we can say event interact. So now this is going to get called whenever the F key is pressed. And so, like I said, inside of here, we basically want to do a line trace to figure out what we are interacting with, right? So to do that, just right click and say line trace by channel is the one we want, and hook that up to when it's pressed. And we want to do a line trace from the camera straight into the world. So we're going to get the first person camera, so we can drag that in, and we'll say get world oops, not world transform, we want get world location. So this is where it's going to start at, because it's going to start at wherever the camera is, right? And then it's going, so that's going to be our start, and then it's going to go from the start into the world in the direction of the camera. So the direction of the camera is the camera's forward vector, so we can say get forward vector, and then we want to multiply that by the distance that we want the interaction, the max interaction distance, because you don't want to be able to open the door from across the map, right? You want to have to be pretty close to the door in order to open it. Same with keys, you want to be pretty close to the key in order to pick it up. So we can kind of define a variable for that, for our interaction distance. So just create a variable here on the right, we'll call it interaction range maybe, and we'll make this a float. And this should probably be like a constant variable that doesn't ever change, so we want it to be blueprint read only, and we also want it to be private. And so I'm just going to add it to a constants category just to keep it nice and clean. And by default, we'll just set it to something like 300. Of course, you can change that to be whatever you want, but this is basically the distance that you have to be from something before you can interact with it. So we'll take our forward vector and we'll say float multiply by our interaction range. And we want to add that to our starting location. So vector plus, oops, like so, and that is our end. So we're going from the camera into the world this distance in the direction of the camera. And we want to trace for visibility, and we want to make sure you have ignore self set. And we can change this draw debug to for duration just so we can see it's kind of working. So if we go back and we play it now and we press F, you'll see it creates a red line, and it goes into the screen wherever you click. Now that little red rectangular thing that it creates is where it collides with. And you'll notice if we go up to the door and we click it, it goes right through the door. And it actually goes through the key as well. And the reason it's doing that is because the door and the key don't actually have any collision on them. And that's something we need to fix before this will actually work. And fortunately for us, that's super easy to do in Unreal. So if you click on the door, we'll do it to the door first. We don't really want collision on the door frame, so we can leave that alone. We only want collision on the door itself. So click on the door, and then click this little magnifying glass next to the static mesh. And that will bring us to the static mesh, and go ahead and open that up. And in this screen, you can edit the collision of an object. So if you come up here to the top, you'll see you can select simple collision. And when it's checked, you'll notice it doesn't add any border around the object because there actually is no simple collision. If you select complex collision, you'll see it creates this complex, or it renders this complex collision. It's basically all the triangles in the model. But we don't want to do collision checks with that because that's really, it's really hard on the computer to check that much collision. We really only want to have a simplified collision on the object. So uncheck this, leave simplified collision check, and we can come up here and we can say add a simplified box collision. And you'll see what it does is it adds a very simple green box that just encapsulates the door. And for our purposes, we just want to know if you're looking at the door, that's like totally good enough. So that's our simple collision added to our door. And we can do the same thing for the key. So if we click on our BB key, and we go to static mesh, and we click on the magnifying glass, it'll bring us to the key. Open that up. Again, if you come up here and click collision and click simplified collision, oh, actually this one does have some collision on it. I guess it was part of the model. But again, this collision is actually way more complex than we actually need. There's really no reason for this. We can just say, we can just come here to collision and remove it and add our own, we'll just use a box. Because really, we don't need anything more complex than this to tell if you're looking at it. So go ahead and save that. So now our door and our key both have collision on them. So if we run it again and we come up here and we press F, you'll see it now creates this little line, or this little red square, because it knows that it collided with the door. And again, it does it for the key as well. One more thing we want to fix before we move any further, you'll notice if I'm looking right at the door handle and I press F, the line actually goes above where I'm aiming. And that's because, for whatever stupid reason, the people that made this demo project put the cursor below the middle of the screen. I don't know why. Well, they did it so it would line up with the projectile, but it was a horrible idea. They shouldn't have done that. So we need to fix that real quick. So go back to the content directory, make sure you're in the content folder and search for HUD because we want to edit this HUD. It's a really simple fix. Just get rid of this stupid thing that they added here to add 20 to the screen. Like, your HUD should be in the middle of your screen, in my opinion. I don't know why it would not be. So just get rid of that. And you'll notice now the crosshair is in the middle of the screen. And when we press F, it goes to where the crosshair is, like it should. So go ahead and close that. Okay, so now we got our line colliding with the door and colliding with the key. So now we want to check when it collides with these objects, we want to know if that object implements that interactable interface that we created. So we can drag off of this line trace channel and we'll do a branch here. And this is just saying, hey, did I actually hit something? Because there's no point, doing any further logic if we didn't actually hit anything. But if we did, we want to drag us out and we want to break this. So type break. And we need to do this drop down here because we need access to these values. And this hit actor is the actor that we hit. So this is going to be our door or our key or whatever we hit, a wall or floor. And we want to say does implement interface. And what this is going to do is allow us to specify an interface. And we want, of course, the interactable interface. So type interactable interface. And it's saying, hey, does this actor we hit implement the interactable interface? And if it does, so we'll drag a branch off of there. If it does, then we want to call this onInteraction function, because remember, in the interactable interface, we created this onInteraction function, which the door defines right here, and the key defines right here. So if it implements this interface, then we want to actually call that function. So drag off of here again, and say onInteraction, and hook that up to true. And I'll just make this a little neater. And it's, again, we want to pass in the player because we want to know who interacted with this object. So the player is just self, so we can say self and get reference to self and hook that up because we're the ones doing the interaction. Okay, so now if we run this, we should be seeing our interactive with key and interactive with door being printed whenever we interact with them. So let's run this. The door, you can see at the top left, it says interact with door. If we click on the key, it says interact with key. If we miss, then it doesn't say anything, or if we go click on a wall, it doesn't say anything because we didn't actually interact with the interactable object. All right, so now we know when the key is being interacted with, we know when the door is being interacted with. We just need to actually do the logic now to grab the key and to open the door if it has the correct key. So let's start with grabbing the key because that's the first step. So basically the way this will work is, if you remember, the keys and the doors have this channel integer, and all it is just an integer, like a number that defines, which key the door is linked to. So if you go to the first person character, we just want to keep track of all of the keys that we have. So to do that, we can just have an array of these key channels. So create a variable, and we'll call this key channels, and this is going to be an integer. So we want this to be private so that nobody else can access it, and I'm going to add it to a private category. And we want this to be a array. So come up here to the right and select array because we're going to have multiple of these key channels potentially at once. And we want to have two functions so we can modify this, because basically when in the key class, when it says event on interaction, we want to take the key and add it to the player. But we can't really do that from the key class because we're not going to have access to key channels because it's private. So we want to create a function for adding a key. So we'll create a function in the player class called add key. And this is going to be public, like it is right now. And it needs to take in an integer for the key channel that we want to add. And this is just going to be super simple. We're just going to say key channels, and we're going to say add unique because we don't want to add the same key channel twice because we don't need to. So add unique. And then while we're here, I'm also going to make one more for checking if the player has a key, because the door is going to need to know that later. So go ahead and create one more function called has key question mark. This one can be pure, and it can also be constant, because it's not going to actually change anything about the class. We're not actually adding a key like we were in the other function. And again, this one's going to be super simple. It's just going to say key channels contains item, and we want to check if it contains an item. So drag this from the 0 into the function name to add a pin, and we're going to rename this one as well to key channel. And we're going to return, so drag this boolean onto the function name, and that'll create a return node with a boolean for true or false. So it's basically just saying, hey, does the player have a key to this channel? All right, so now we have those two functions, we can implement our onInteraction functions. So we'll do the key first. So go to the key, and inside of here, the first thing we want to make sure, we can delete this print. First thing we want to make sure is that the player is valid, because if the player is not valid, then obviously we're not going to be able to add ourselves to the player. So we'll say is valid, just to make sure that, somebody didn't call this with an invalid player or something nasty like that. But in the case that it is valid, then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to say player add key and hook that up to is valid. And of course, the key channel that we want to add is our key channel. So drag that in like so. And so once he grabs the key, we'll add our key channel to the player, and then we want to destroy the key at that point, because he picked up the key. So we can say right click and destroy actor like so. So now if we go ahead and we test this, we should be able to pick up the key. So hit play, hook the key, hit F. You can see we pick up the key. And now the player knows that he can unlock doors that are on channel 0. But of course, if we go up to the door and try to open it, it won't quite work yet, because we haven't written the logic in the door. So that's our onKey onInteracted function. So let's implement the door one now. So click on the door. And this one's going to be pretty simple as well. We want to say, we can again delete this print string. Again, we want to make sure that the player is valid. So we'll do an is valid check on the player. And if it is valid, the first thing we want to do is we want to check that the player has the key required to open this door. So we'll say player has key. And of course, the key channel that we want to check for is the key channel that's required to open this door. And off of this, we'll do a branch to check if it's true. And hook that up to is valid. If it is valid, then we want to basically open the door. And if it's not valid, we want to close the door. So just to make sure this is working, we'll just add a print string to true. And we'll say can open door. And if it's false, we'll say cannot open door. So if we go ahead and run this and I click interact, you can say this is cannot open door on the top left. And if I grab the key and then I try to open it, it says can open door. So that's working. So the very last thing we need to do is make it so that the door actually opens and closes. And to do that, we're going to come down here. We're going to create two events. So add custom event, one for opening the door. So type open, and one for closing the door. So add custom event and close. So if we're opening the door, we want to set open to true. And if we're closing the door, we want to set open to false, like that. And then from there, we want to do a timeline that's going to actually handle the rotating of the door itself. So right click and create a timeline. And we'll call this rotate door timeline. And if you double click on the timeline, you can edit it. And inside of here, we want to add a float track. And we'll call the float track the door rotation, because that's what it's going to represent. And so what the timeline is basically going to do is over X amount of time, and we can go ahead and specify that right now. We'll say that it takes 1 second to open the door, so set the length to 1. It'll go from the left side to the right side of this graph based on these key nodes or these keys that we add. So if you right click, you can add a key to the curve. So right click and add a key, and make sure the key is selected. And then up here at the top, we want to set the first key to 0 time and the value to 0. So that's basically saying, when it first starts out, when you first start opening the door, the rotation should be 0 because it's not open yet. And then if you right click again and create a new key, we'll say after 1 full second, we want the door to be at, let's say like 110 degrees. So it's a little bit more than, 90 degrees, because doors open a little bit further than that in reality. And so if you click these two little buttons to the left, it will kind of fit it nicely. So you can see we go from 0, 0 to 1, 110. So this is our rotation over time. So if we come back to the event graph, we can now hook up our open and our close this function. So when we open it, we want to play it. And when we close it, we want to reverse it because we want it to go backwards, right? And then the only thing we need to do is we need to take this door rotation and actually update our door's rotation. So drag in the door, and we want to set the relative rotation because it's going to be relative to wherever the door frame is. So set relative rotation and hook that up to the update. And we want to split this rotation because we only want to modify one axis. And if you go back to the viewport and you click on the door, you can see we want the door to rotate, like this, right? And so that rotation, if you look, it's going to be around this z-axis, this blue one. That's the axis it's rotating around, is the z. So if you go back to the event graph, we want to hook the door rotation up to the z. And so the last thing we need to do is delete these prints. And again, we'll say if we have the key to it, then we'll call the open function that we just made, or open event. Otherwise, we'll call the close one. So hook that up like so. Compile, save. So now if we run this, unless I mess something up, oh, I did mess something up. So deconnect these, hold down Alt and left click. We need to do one more check first, so drag those over there. We need to check if the door is actually open to determine if we should open or close it, because this is just checking if we have the key. So if we have the key, we want to drag in the open variable and do a branch off of that. And we want to say if it's open, then we want to actually have these reversed. If it's open, we want to close it. And if it's not open, we want to open it. So there, that's what it should look like. So again, just to recap, we're saying when the door is interacted with, if the player that interacted with it is valid, we want to check if the player has the key that corresponds to our door on that channel. And if it does, then we'll say if the door is open, close it, otherwise open it. So go ahead and run this. Again, if we go up and we press F, can't open the door. If we select the key, we now have the key, and we go up to the door, open, and you can see it slides open. We can't actually walk through it, and that's just because our guy is actually a little bit too fat. So if you go to the first-person character and you click on the capsule component, you can see he's quite large. So if we reduce this to like 22 or something, make him a little skinnier, or make the door bigger or something, he'll be able to walk through it. So we click on the key and the door. You can see now he can walk through the door. We can open and close it as much as we want. And then just to show you that the channels are working, if we click on this and then control click on this, and then we'll do an Alt and drag it so we can copy it. If we change this one to be on channel 1 and this key to be on channel 1, then you'll see that this key can only open this door. So if I grab this key and try to open this door, it's not going to let me, but it will let me open this door. And so I can't actually open that door until I grab this key, and now I can open that door. So again, this is a pretty simple, you can definitely expand upon this if you need to, but it's a pretty simple, straightforward way of having keys that open specific doors. So if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment. Thanks.